Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have our honored guest speaking, Ambassador Eileen Malloy. Yes. So I would like again to tell maybe informally about your bio, based on what we have with Ambassador Malloy during more than 25 years, yeah, of our joint probably work and efforts before when I was an ambassador for Kyrgyz Republic to the United States. Ambassador Malloy, she was an ambassador of the United States to the Kyrgyz Republic. And this was a time when we were able with the ambassador to so many things related to the economic reforms, related to the promotion of democracy, exchanges, education programs. And Ambassador Malloy was able also to work in many other capacities as well. She also was the Consul General of the United States to Sydney. In addition to that, she worked at the State Department in different capacities, dealing with the area of the Russia, Eurasia. She worked also in embassy in Moscow as well, different capacities. Albania was passionate always about the Balkans. And I remember how when we worked on the normal trade relations status for the Kyrgyz Republic, yeah, you were at that time also helping for Albania to become the same way to get the same status and promoting trade with the United States. And Ambassador Malloy is very again passionate about countries of the former Soviet Union, in particular also Kyrgyzstan. She is now in the board of the trustees of the Eurasia Foundation. Please keep in mind, if you work with the region, it's one of the NGOs which is promoting this partnership cooperation and provides also grants. And she is involved also with Kyrgyzstan quite a lot. And as a former foreign service officer, she continues to get engaged with the students. In particular, Ambassador Malloy, if you could also tell about the resources and opportunities for our students to be involved through internships and other type of activities with the State Department would be also appreciated. Yeah? So probably on this note, I'll just stop and give you a podium for you just to make a presentation for our students. Yeah? Thank you much.
Thank you for that. First sound check. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes. Yeah.
Good, good. Yeah. Okay, well, what I wanted to start off doing is just a quick survey of the physical structure of embassies. They are all part of the executive branch, obviously. They're under the control of the Secretary of State, currently Antony Blinken. And normally, the positions are filled by career foreign service officers. They have to be confirmed by the US Senate before they go out, contrary to whatever you may have seen in a very popular recent TV series on diplomats. Some ambassadors are actually from the Foreign Commercial Service, the Foreign Agricultural Service, so it's not just State Department. At any one time, depending on the president, 30 to 40% of ambassadors are what we call politically appointed ambassadors, meaning they are not career foreign service, but they bring a wealth of knowledge about business practices, leadership, fundraising for presidents, all sorts of things. But it's a continuous bone of contention that these high-profile embassies such as London, Paris, Tokyo, are in effect not available for career Foreign Service officers who've spent their whole life getting ready to be an ambassador. There are two kinds of missions. By far the most common are bilateral missions, meaning it's an embassy in the host nation capital city, and its primary focus is relationships with that particular country and the United States, promoting the image of the United States, and making sure that Washington understands clearly what the strengths, weaknesses, and possibilities are in the host nation. We try to have an embassy in every country of the world, but it's become increasingly more difficult as new embassies come online. You may have noticed in newspapers that we're now opening missions in some of the micro states in the South Pacific. That's being driven by the fact that the Chinese are actively working in these areas, and the US feels that we need to have access to the same people. The size of an embassy really hinges on its importance to the United States. Traditionally, we may have had a very large mission in the 1800s in a certain country, but it's no longer on the front line of the threats to the United States or US business. So you see those gradually declining in size. Many of the European countries would fall in that category. And then the State Department shifts those resources to the new embassies or embassies that need to be rapidly expanded because of new threats or new possible benefits for the US. A typical embassy has 5 different types of State Department officers. There'd be the political officers, the economic officers, the consular officers, the management officers, and also when USIA was merged into state, we now have public affairs officers. USIA being the old United States Information Agency. So if you're thinking of joining the Foreign Service, you would want to understand the roles of each of these and look to see what suits your strengths and what kind of work you would enjoy. And there's actually a very useful book that I'm going to put up here now. It's called Inside a U.S. Embassy and edited by Sean Dorman. It's in its 5th or 6th edition now. And it takes you through a typical day in the life of each of these officers. So I highly recommend taking a look at it. In addition to the State Department, our embassies are responsible for the other branches of the US government. For example, congressional delegations travel frequently, and when they do, the embassy arranges their hotel accommodation exchange with the host currency, sets up their appointments. Likewise, when we get visits from Supreme Court justices, we do the same thing to support them. So state does not only support State Department players. Security is critically important these days, and the host nation is actually responsible for the security of diplomatic facilities. And sometimes that doesn't work. And the example being Pakistan, when the host nation didn't respond quickly enough and a mob burnt the embassy to the ground and the housing compound, and several American lives were lost. What happens in those circumstances is the host nation becomes responsible for the cost of rebuilding the facility. Obviously, there's nothing that can be done for the families of those who lost their lives. Inside the embassy, there's a regional security officer who has prime responsibility for security of information and also physical security. And in almost every embassy, There is a Marine Security Guard detachment that stands watch 24 hours a day. And contrary to portrayals in television shows and movies, the Marine Guard are not there to protect the people working in the embassy, but rather the information, the classified information. They do, however, step in whenever they can and provide physical security support, especially when a mission is under attack. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the structure. Now, when of a bilateral mission, I was ambassador at a bilateral mission in Sharjah and another one. So I've served in that role in both Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan. And my time in Kyrgyzstan was fascinating because it was a physically small country, but it was playing well above its weight in terms of international dynamics. It had left the Soviet Union, made a lot of firsts in terms of establishing its independence, was run by a president who professed to be a Jeffersonian Democrat. And so the United States government really wanted to support this group. And our role in the embassy was, first of all, to maintain one-on-one relationships with Kyrgyz government and legislative and judicial officials to get a sense of what they needed in order to move ahead on establishing a vibrant democracy and a rule of law economy, to which the US government was putting in close to $50 million a year when I was there, in financial support through US Agency for International Development. So at that time, aside from Israel, on a per capita basis, the Kyrgyz were getting more aid than any other country in the world. Not too long after I left, the very strong Armenian lobby upped the amount going into Armenia every year, and the Kyrgyz lost that moniker, but they did a very good job with what they got. And one of the greatest successes was establishing a civil society that to this day is still very vibrant. Unfortunately, the country, the government, has done some backsliding, and now a number of journalists are in prison, and the international community's not as confident about the future of Kyrgyzstan as a free democracy because of some moves they've taken, but they can always get back on track. And I believe with the right leadership, they will. When I was there, it was a very small embassy. We had one each of the positions that I mentioned. We had a political officer, we had an economics officer, a management officer, 2 consular officers, a USIA officer. We didn't have Marines at all. We didn't have a security officer. We had a communicator. So it was a very small operation, but it grew. While I was there, we added a defense attaché, and we added a USAID officer to oversee all the contractors running these programs in Kyrgyzstan. After I left, when the conflict was renewed in Afghanistan, a decision was made by the Kyrgyz government to allow the United States to use a runway, an airbase in Kyrgyzstan to support US military and coalition operations in Afghanistan. And in a very short period of time, a rather large US military detachment was set up there. They did a great job. The Kyrgyz were wonderful hosts, but inevitably irritants cropped up over security concerns. And I don't know the details, but I believe at some point an ethnic Kyrgyz truck driver was killed by security guards thinking that it was a truck bomber. So there were a number of irritants that eventually led the government of Kyrgyzstan to ask that the U.S. leave. And they did. But it was an interesting time period to see how they worked together. I personally have to believe that there was pressure from the Russian government, who also maintain an air base in Kyrgyzstan, to get the U.S. forces out of there. They really didn't want the U.S. to have a footprint in Central Asia of any kind. So with that quick survey of embassies, let me talk about what we call constituent posts. Those are not embassies, but they are consulate generals or consulates or consular agents. They take different forms in cities outside the capital where there's a need. So if you look at a map of U.S. diplomatic facilities in Mexico, you'll see this proliferation of consulates. And that's because there is a very large U.S. citizen retiree population. So you may find a consulate that has Social Security there to help them out. There's death in estates from this retiree population. And there's huge demands for U.S. visas. There's commercial opportunities in some places outside of the capital, say in India, where you have the focus of IT in a city where you'll see a consulate opened. Or it could be the media and artistic center of a country, like Kolkata in India. So you'll see a consulate there. So it really is driven by the need for representation in that specific facility. And there are many legacy consulates that the State Department would really like to close because the historic reason it doesn't exist anymore because the population shifts or changes. Matter of fact, at one point, as a consular officer, I was responsible for U.S. merchant marine sailors that would come into the port, and you'd have to go down and make notations in their booklet and make sure they were being treated properly. Well, that role has disappeared entirely. So a lot of consulates in the old port cities aren't really needed anymore. When I was Consul General in Sydney, Australia, it was an unusual consulate because it was larger than your average embassy. It was in a country, Australia, that had created what we call an artificial capital, Canberra. But the economic, social, media, press functions, commercial functions of Australia were in Sydney, and it was the gateway to Australia. So if we had a visiting congressional delegation or we had the Deputy Secretary of State from the United States, you couldn't get them beyond Sydney. They wouldn't travel down to Canberra for meetings. So the Australians would have to come up from Canberra and have their meetings in Sydney. So we had a large array of State Department functions. We also had other agencies there. The commercial service was there, not in Canberra, because they saw no point to be down there, and others. So every consulate is different, and our role of in the consulate changed dramatically after September 11. We were in a legacy consulate. We were on the, I think, 70th floor was the World Trade Center in Sydney. Great location, 360-degree views because we had two whole floors. We could watch the planes taking off from Sydney Airport, flying right past us. Well, what was scenic before September 11 became terrifying after September 11. And the security concerns were such that I was put under a 24/7 personal protective detail by the Australian Federal Police, which meant without my team advancing wherever I was going and escorting me there, I couldn't leave the consulate. I couldn't leave my home. I couldn't even walk my dog. It was a complete change in the way we lived. The cost of providing security for our consulates and our embassies is prohibited. There's new security regimes imposed after embassies were blown up in several countries, and it includes setback, that no vehicle can come within a certain square footage of an embassy in case it had a bomb. Well, if you have a legacy consulate right on the street, like US Embassy London, in an iconic location, the pressure to move way out into the shipyards and build a new embassy that met all these security requirements becomes intense. So Embassy London did have to move. A number of other embassies around the world have had to move. And indeed, Consulate General Sydney is in the process of leaving the downtown and moving way out into a far-flung residential area. And as you can imagine, how that affects the relationship with the host government, who wants to drive an hour to have a business lunch or more. It's very sad. And this is something that's affected the work of all of these missions. This first kind of embassies are bilateral. You also have what we call multilateral missions. And most of you are familiar with one of the biggest in the world, which is the United Nations. So there's a US mission to the United Nations. There is a US mission to NATO, to the European Union, and a number of other smaller functional multilateral missions around the world. If you serve in a multilateral mission, your job may still be as political officer, but instead of lobbying a host government to support US policy on X, Y, or Z, you instead are working with hundreds of members of that particular institution. In the case of the UN or European Union, you're dealing with all the members of the European Union, the OSCE in Vienna, all the members. So it's a very different type of approach to work. And some people absolutely love it. I personally prefer the bilateral missions. And then last but not least, there are special envoys. You may have heard of John Kerry, who just retired from his role as special envoy for climate change. Dick Holbrooke was famously the special envoy for the conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina and brokered the Dayton Accords. So they're quite well known, but there's actually dozens and dozens of these special envoys for Holocaust restitutions, for Sudan conflict right now, for Libya. And quite often it's used when we can't physically open a mission in that country, like Libya right now. And so they have to be supported, and they play a key role in policy. And in sometimes that challenges making sure you don't get crosswise with their issue, which can be unpleasant if you do, because these are heavy hitters. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that have radically changed the way we do work in the State Department. And the first is new technology. When I arrived, we communicated with Washington by what are called cables. Anybody who's reviewed some of the WikiLeaks losses has read State Department cables. And they could be boringly administrative in nature, or they can be fascinating snippets of what the political officer at Post thought would be the key issues coming down the pike and who the power players were. They could make great reading. The other way of communicating was something that has disappeared entirely. They were called airgrams, and that was for lengthier, more in-depth things. And they would be mailed by mail, post office, from wherever you were in the world back to Washington. And it could take months for them to arrive, which is why nobody uses them anymore. But then in the 80s and 90s, this communication channel, and you notice I didn't mention telephone, because in many places you couldn't make calls from Moscow. You could not call the Department of State. You would have to deal with the Soviet operators and request a reservation for a phone call. It would take days to come through, and they were sitting there listening to you. So in those days, telephones were not used. All of a sudden, faxes appeared. When I was serving at Embassy London, we had a political appointee ambassador, Margaret Heckler. She'd been in the US Congress, and she wanted a fax machine. Well, they didn't exist in embassies. The State Department's always been way behind in technology, but she called the White House and insisted, and we got a fax machine. And all of a sudden, a desk officer could almost instantly send the ambassador a post, a fax. It was amazing. Of course, nobody uses them anymore. Then when I was in Kyrgyzstan, the embassy didn't get internet, but at my home, my husband is an IT techie, and he brought in our personal email, which was huge because we had a high schooler back in the States, and we could actually communicate with this child instead of waiting weeks for the mail to arrive. Though, like many teenagers, most of the communications were revolving around send money. But still, it was good to know that she was healthy and alive. Internet became a huge part of diplomatic communications. But again, embassies didn't get it for a very long time. And when they did get it, it was an internal system. It wasn't connected out in any way. You couldn't, check into Amazon while you were on lunch or speak to your friends. So subsequently, every computer at the State Department did get access to the internet. And what happened at that point was embassy officers started talking to their counterparts in the host government via internet. Instead of a diplomatic note requesting an appointment, they'd send the desk officer an email saying, hey, my ambassador needs to come by today and talk about X, Y, or Z, which sounds wonderful. But this is the point where the historians of the State Department and the folks whose job it is to retain records that show how policies were decided, how they were implemented, this is where they lost complete track of what was going on at embassies and missions overseas because nobody was keeping records. It was all on the internet. That subsequently changed, though to this day, people really balk at taking that extra step to file their emails in records. The next thing was cell phones. And all of a sudden you had special envoys talking on their cell phones about whatever the issue was, giving a briefing to the desk officer back in the United States or to their counterparts in other countries. Well, everybody listens to cell phones. So the most famous incident was when Toria Newland, our assistant secretary for European affairs, was on the phone to the US ambassador in Kiev during the independence movement and the violence going on there. And at one point, Jeff Pyatt, the ambassador, said, well, we can't do that. What about the Europeans? And Tory famously responded with a word I won't use, the Europeans. And at that point, everybody had to realize that the Russians were listening to everything because they're the ones that publicized her remarks to drive a wedge between the United States and the Europeans on Ukraine. Well, it didn't work in driving a wedge, but it did work to really press hard for State Department officers to be much more cautious about the use of telephones when conducting official business. So the one last thing in technology I'd mention is the use of the internet for information purposes. And in the old days, if you wanted information on, let's say, how to adopt a child in a foreign country, you'd have to get on a telephone and find your way through the State Department to get the right person who hopefully would answer your call and give you the information. Well, now it's all posted online. If you want to know the security situation in a country because you're going to go visit there, you just go on the State Department's website, posted, updated, adopt a child. You want to establish citizenship for your newborn child, it's all online. As a matter of fact, just starting in February, the entire process of testing to join the Foreign Service is done online, and they've just added the oral assessment online as well. So you can soup to nuts apply to join the Foreign Service and get a final decision all online. And this was done for a variety of reasons. Our intake was primarily East Coast. It's pretty expensive if you're a student in California to fly to Washington, D.C. for the oral assessment. And also they were concerned about diversity. So their hope is that this will bring in geographic diversity, racial diversity, rather than the old system. So that's technology. The other big change is the threat to the United States. My whole childhood and all the way up through the first half of my career in the Foreign Service, the threat was the Soviet Union. They were the only country with nuclear weapons that had hostility toward the US and the ability to inflict damage. Now, I know China also had weapons, but they really weren't at a point where they presented the same threat to the United States as the Soviet. That all changed when the Soviet Union broke up and everybody was congratulating themselves on the peace dividend and thinking, well, how are we going to spend US government money that used to be trying to deter the Soviets? How are we going to spend that? Can we spend it on domestic priorities like education and rebuilding roads? There was a very short honeymoon before the awful realization set in that the new threat was transnational. And by that, I mean, it could be drug cartels, it could be trafficking in people, it could be major infectious diseases. And how do we protect the US? There were so many transnational issues that cropped up that we had to completely rethink the way we handled it because it wasn't just based in one country overseas. So you started seeing a proliferation of technical specialists at embassies overseas. They might work for Department of Homeland Security, could be FBI, Department of Justice, ATF, DEA, all of these where you had to start finding places in the legacy embassies for them to work. The plus side is you had a much more informed view of what these transnational threats were. The downside was the ambassador, who was responsible for every American in country operating under chief of mission authority, had a flat line of supervising 27 different agencies. So the State Department, in some cases, became the smallest entity at Post, but somehow they were supposed to know that all these agencies were operating in accordance with US laws, procedures, and that they were keeping the ambassador fully informed. So it was almost unworkable. And the last 10 years I was at the State Department, I led inspection teams. And I would go to an embassy like Bogota, Colombia, and I would evaluate how well the ambassador was ensuring that all these agencies were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And they weren't. They weren't. And what brought it all to a head is when one gentleman playing a game with his girlfriend and his service revolver ended up shooting himself, killing himself. Not suicide, but just drinking, and I don't know what they were doing. And then when we looked at this man was from the Bureau of Prisons and had nobody at post responsible for supervising him. His supervisor was somewhere back in the United States in the Bureau of Prisons. Nobody knew anything about him. And it just brought to a fore that we really needed to improve how we were handling what we call command for the ambassadors. We'd had to give them new tools. And we also had to take a long, hard look at firearms in U.S. embassies. Any agency that normally uses firearms in the United States was insisting that they needed to have their own firearms in the host country. Well, this gentleman played absolutely no role other than as an interlocutor with the Bureau of Prisons. He had no reason to have a firearm. And even if he did, there was no process for making sure it was accounted for. He was properly trained. It was secured at the end of the business day. So we started over the course of 10 years, a two-pronged approach. How could we help ambassadors with the right tools to keep the command and control functions operating properly? And how can we look at firearms overseas and make sure that they were being handled in accordance with not states' rules, but their own agency rules? So that was a pretty profound impact. The last thing that I would mention, if you want to talk about it, is generational change. I'm from the tail end of the baby boomers. Then the Gen Xers came, and the Gen Y and Gen Z, and on and on. And each one of them had a different approach to authority, to what they considered basic human rights. The most recent consider full internet access in their residences overseas a basic human right. Now, if you say that to a baby boomer like myself, whose life predated the internet, that's kind of a far flung, but this is the way people are growing up and changing, and they expect the Foreign Service to change with them, and the Foreign Service doesn't change quickly. So over the course of my 30-plus year career, when I started as a single parent, my infant child was my problem, not the department's. If they moved me from place A to B and they wanted me to stop in Washington for training, they didn't even include my child on the orders. It was like, you do whatever you want. Leave your child, who was then, I don't know, 2 years old, somewhere along the way. Now the State Department allows mothers with infants to take the infant on official business travel within country or internationally. There's lactation rooms at every embassy. So there's been these major changes for people like me, to view them as major. But for the current officers coming into the system, it's still not enough. The department needs to do a lot more in terms of work and personal life balance in order to retain people. And we're actually having trouble filling jobs, believe it or not. Not just the Foreign Service officers, but the office management assistants, the information technology assistants. We're having a hard time keeping them. So the department's doing a lot of soul searching and trying to figure out how to do this and do it properly. So with that,
we have 9 minutes left. Yeah,
maybe I'm gonna shut up and
No, just a couple, because I know the students have a lot of questions, but if we'll be not able to ask all of them, maybe we send you by email if it's possible. Yep, please.
sure.
Yeah, sorry.
What was your favorite embassy to serve in?
It has to be Kyrgyzstan, and not just because Baki's sitting there. It had a huge impact on my whole family. My younger daughter, who was there as a first, second, third grader, is an artist and a very free spirit who dreams of someday going back and riding horses in Kyrgyzstan. It was a tremendous experience for us.
And father as well. You remember how you went with father. Yeah, please, again, guys, we have yes.
You mentioned the US opening embassies in places like the Pacific because China is doing it. So do they have to like find a particular interest in the country that they're opening, or are they just doing it because China is also doing it?
A little bit of both. If you have been watching China's Belt and Road project around the world, not just in the Pacific, but in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, they are investing in infrastructure in countries in ways that gives them control. So for instance, they might go in and fund the construction of an airport in that country. They might go in and fund the construction of a port that's of sufficient size that could handle large Chinese ships. They're investing in internet in these countries, which gives them control, where the US has never gone in and invested in infrastructure in countries. That's just not the way we operate. But there is a concern this is going to create issues with worldwide transportation if the airports are controlled by the Chinese, with commercial ships and indeed military port visits if the port is controlled by the Chinese, and so on. So it's both the global issue of China and then what they're doing in that individual country.
Please, yes.
Sorry, I have so many questions. My next question is about the security. So you also mentioned that they provide security to protect the information and not basically the people. So for places like Sudan, where it's like there's a lot of like crime and war going on, wouldn't they also have to offer protection to the people?
Well, if you have US diplomats, as you have in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, the US Marine detachment in the embassy wouldn't be responsible for them. That's where you actually have a COCAM. So you have a US military combatant commander in country with Marines or Army or SEALs or whatever. And those are the people that provide the security for US diplomats outside of the embassy for the most part. If you're in a country where you don't have a combatant commander, because there's no ongoing military operation, it falls to the host government. So for instance, I mentioned when I was in Australia, the Australian Federal Police provided security for me, not because I asked for it, but because they did a threat analysis and felt that there were enough elements in the Sydney area that would very happily make me disappear forever, that they as the host nation had to make sure that didn't happen. So there's different circumstances. So if an embassy is under siege, the Marine Security Guard detachment will go and get a shotgun from where they're stored, and they will man their post, but they don't leave the embassy and provide security to Americans. That doesn't happen.
Thank you. So we have 4 more minutes, so couple more questions. Oh, okay, please, Winnie.
The last question. Thank you. The last question that I have is back to the multilateral embassies like the UN and NATO. I don't know if you mentioned it and I missed it, but do they go through the same like system of being appointed like the regular diplomats, or is it different?
The UN system, you have to think about, there's our mission to the UN, then there's the UN system. The UN appoints its own people all around the world. I mean, I have friends who are serving in Brasilia right now for the UN, and we don't play any role in that. Sometimes they'll select an American to do that, but that's totally separate from the US mission to the UN. That is primarily career Foreign Service officers. Matter of fact, our head right now is a highly respected US ambassador, and Linda Greenfield Thomas, and she's serving there. I don't believe she retired. I think she is a current career Foreign Service officer. Usually that is a political appointee post. You had some very heavy hitters there over the years, but every once in a while, it's a career officer. Depends on the president and the level of confidence that he or she someday has in the mission up there. Some presidents have viewed it as total waste of time. Others, starting with George Bush Sr., found that it was incredibly useful during the first Gulf War. And ever since then, you've seen more and more powerful people appointed to that job.
Okay. Who else? By the way, guys who are sitting in cyberspace, yeah, do you have any questions? Okay, so then, Excellency, with again your permission, yeah, because still we have some questions. I know the students they would like also to ask maybe personal things. With your permission, maybe you could continue our communication, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So yeah.
I'd be happy to answer them by email. I can also send you the information on this book in an email if you're interested inside a U.S. embassy. I'm pretty sure it's available on Amazon.
And thank you for your continued cooperation and support to our students' efforts. But you came in 17th year, and I am hoping that still you will be able to come here. Washington State and Utah is very close, and I know that you are still with your husband and family.
I would love to visit. Utah is one of my favorite. You've got the best parks out there.
Yeah. Thank you. So hope to see you again, and thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thank you much. Yeah.
All the best.